As the speaker has just informed us, the recording is in progress and we'll get started with our lecture for tonight. Firstly, of course, for those in facility tonight, in the event of emergency, please follow myself or any of our other staff just to the emergency evacuation exits at the back of the building. If at any point in the night you need to use the ablutions, female toilets to my left, male toilets to my right, and we will, of course, have a short supper on at the very end of this evening. I have a quick note from our excellent supper team, though, which is we are looking for volunteers. The supper that we run here at our in-person lectures is always a wonderful experience. However, we do need help to make that happen. So if you are interested in helping with that, you're more than welcome to please speak to Ron, who you'll find back in the kitchen for the next little while, and then out here on the floor serving the hot drinks a bit later on. Now, with being a member of our supper team does come a few advantages, including a car park downstairs, in addition to reimbursement for any food that you might bring along. Additionally, of course, if we can get for people, we are aiming for you simply need to do 1-2 nights at most per year as part of that supper team. So it isn't a massive impost on you throughout our annual program. Without further ado, though, I will invite Henk up to present to us. Henk is a geophysicist, though 40 years experience, specialising in reflection seismic surveys. Yes, I'm sorry. Henk will be talking to us tonight, though, about J.W. Gregory and his various expeditions and achievements and retracing some of his steps. Henk, please, welcome to the presentation. Thanks, John.
Put that in my pocket and hope for the best. Okay, so tonight's presentation is might be a little bit different to what you've seen in the past. I'm doing this on Google Earth, and so there will be some hitches. I know that because every time I look at it, I find new ones, but I can fake it. This is where we are tonight, and this is where I live. So, so yeah, I've come the least distance of anyone tonight. Okay, so I'm just going to start this talk with how I came across Mr. Gregory. And I was given a task of exploring in this area, which is out near Carnarvon Gorge, in fact. And not a lot of exploration goes on at Carnarvon Gorge, as you can well imagine. And I was looking for, the government has a tremendous repository of old reports. And went looking for the work and then found that this report from 1926. And these geologists had found their way up to this part of the world by catching the train to, I think it was Mitchell, and then come up on horseback to explore in this country. And so, as ever, I'm always interested in these reports. And so I read through this and I went to the references at the back and I found The Dead Heart of Australia by Professor J.W. Gregory. And another well, The Flowing Wells of Central Australia by Professor J.W. Gregory. I had never heard of J.W. Gregory, but I was captivated by the name of the book, by the name of the reference. Further on, there's a reference to T.W.E. David, Edgeworth David, and as a collector of stamps when I was a young man, I had heard of Edgeworth Davis, and here he is on a stamp in 1974 as the first ever series of famous Australians. So that's quite a thing to be a geologist and get onto the first 4 stamps of famous Australians. So Here's an outline of my talk. I'm going to talk about Jack Gregory's early life, some of the adventures he got into before, the dead heart of Australia, that particular trip, racialism as they called it in the day, and some of the things that have come since his death. These are my two main references here. They're actually out the back on a table out there, which you can have a look through. And most of the images that you'll see are from these two books. We'll go back to where he was born and where he worked in London. And he worked at the Natural History Museum. And his job was to that's not what I wanted. Here it is. So he worked in wool classing. His father was a wool classer, and he worked in wool classing for a while, but he wanted to be a geologist. He studied at night and was fascinated and became interested in echinoids, and is a specialist in echinoids, which is even so specialized that I don't even know what an echinoid is, but it's a fossil type. He had many field trips to Europe and America, collecting corals, bryozoa, echinoids. He translated papers from French, Italian, German, and Russian, but never spoke them. So that's a pretty amazing achievement. And he became a fellow of the Royal Society, the Geological Society of London, and later he became a fellow of the Royal Society. His first trip was to the Great Rift Valley of East Africa. And this trip was organised by somebody else, and he went along as part of as a scientist at the with the blessing of the Museum of London to look for fossils. This is always his excuse for going on these trips, was to look for fossils so that he could go and do his exploration activities. This trip was an utter failure. They never left Lamu. They had 1,500. Yeah, they hired some guards, 1,500 guards to take with them. So the whole job got out of hand. They couldn't manage the logistics of it. So he went back in 1982 and this was his trip there. Again, he started from Lamu, and you have to remember there was no Nairobi at that stage. So this was the most important town in Kenya, or British East Africa as it was called. I was much less ambitious. It took 41 men, 33 porters, and a cook and a tent boy. He led the trip. It was more scientific in nature, and 2,650 kilometres, which they would have walked or taken horses. It's not very clear. This is the some of the images from the see a photo in a second of a glacier on top of Mount Kenya, who's more or less disappeared now. That's his photograph there. And again, quite a lot more snow at the time. Collected some fossils, but as a geologist, he also mapped the Rift Valley. And that area is now very important for helium exploration. It's always been of great interest, the Rift Valley. There's a note here that he didn't have proper winter clothes, and the thermometers they took only went down to 10 degrees Fahrenheit. So they weren't good enough for the expedition up to the top of Mount Kenya. The next trip he took, he got around, was to Spitsbergen. Now, for those of you who might be like me and didn't know the difference between Spitsbergen and Svalbard, it's the same place. It's just that it's just depending on what side of politics you're on, whether you're Russian or English or Dutch, it was Spitsbergen or Svalbard. Kind of broken up sometimes by these two islands. And this is the trip that he took. And we'll look at some of these photos. There's two that I want to show you. This boat is called the S. I don't know. Probably there'd be mistakes. This boat, called the Express, was in the bay at the time with a bunch of tourists, and they had come to see this man who was taking off by balloon, hydrogen-filled balloon, to the North Pole. And he didn't make a successful attempt on this trip, but he went back there, and the following year, and set off to the North Pole and disappeared. He lasted 3 days, and they found him in 1930. They found his camp, and there's a wonderful movie which you can, I think it's called The Flight of the Eagle, that talks about this. It's occasionally on SBS, they bring it up out of darkness, but it's just a fantastic story. You can have a fantastic story of failure. So his next move was to Melbourne. He was offered a job as a Professor of Geology at the University of Melbourne. And he'd also agreed to go with Robert Falcon Scott to Antarctica, and the university said, that's fine, you can go. But in the meantime, he'd fallen out with Mr. Scott and decided not to go. So he was working at the university. He was the first Professor of Geology. That had a Professor of Natural Science here before. And he wanted to spend his summer usefully. He didn't like, because he wasn't going to Antarctica, he decided that he might take a nice holiday to Lake Eyre with the idea of collecting fossils. So that was quite a contrast. So he caught the train to Adelaide. And just put a map here. Where? I'll pop in a second. There it is. So this is the 1887 map of the railways in South Australia. And his intention was to travel to there it is. Taking a little while to pop up. So that's his train trip that he had planned from Adelaide. One of the things that he was, there was a letter to the editor in Adelaide wondering why he would be travelling to Adelaide at that, travelling to time there. And I thought it just the language was nice. It said it was hot enough to make a crowbar sweat. That seems to have fallen out of our language, but that's a great line to use. Everywhere he went, they asked him, why are you going in the summer? And he said, because this is the only time we have. And then after a while, he just avoided the question. So that's his trip. The train trip to Maori took 2 days. It was called Herget Springs at the time. And they changed the name in 1916 as part of the, or 1918. There was a lot of anti-German feeling, and a lot of towns in Adelaide, in South Australia, and streets and place names in Queensland and South Australia were the main places where this happened. Some places changed back. They changed to Maori at Herget Springs, and they never changed it back. Train timetable here was every 2 days. This line up to Coward Springs was every every 1 week, and then from there to Warren or Peak was every 2 weeks. So there's a fair bit of planning to go on there to arrive and catch a train back, because there's only every second Wednesday that his train could come back. The railway mapping at that time, I thought it just so much more extensive than it is now, which so that's the current train system. And even that has got maps. It's still got the old Garm line in there, which is just listed as abandoned. So, and a lot of these train tracks over here are narrow gauge. They're not pedestrian. They're designed for grain harvesting. This is the map, and you can see his path there in terms of set off from Maori. I divided the trip into 3. I call this the Brisbane Road, or the Queensland Road, as they used to call it. We now know it as the Birdsville Track. This section along Cooper Creek, and then the walk up to, he lists it as the Diamantina, but we now know it as the Warburton River. Okay. Okay, the first train to Herget or Margaret Maori was 1884. So what they'd had at that time was a lot of good weather, and there were cattle stations in the area that were doing very well. And they felt that the South Australian government at least felt that they could, by putting a train line up there, they would be able to support this increased industry. By about 1900 or even the mid 1890s, the weather had gone bad, and that whole economic model had failed. I mean, we talk about the centenary drought now, but these people were living it, and they went. There's this statistic here that one of the stations had 400,000 cattle in the 1890s, and by 1900 they had a few thousand. So huge, just very ambitious to be trying to farm up in this area. I'm going to switch this up. This came up in my research. Just get rid of that map. Oh, yeah. Here we go. There's Maori name. He was about 18 1990, 1999, 1989, about 30 years old. So here's a photograph of them leaving for heading off to leave Herbert Springs. And those are the baggage camels. The first night accommodation, there is still the actual springs called Herbert Springs still exist, but they moved the town down to meet the railway line. The first night was at Lake Eyre, where they tried to grow dates unsuccessfully. They got attacked by corellas and goats and wild weather. And the other place that's still on the map, still useful, is still, the second night was a place called Dolkanina. And you can see there's still accommodation there now. That's a tourist spot now. It's been redeveloped in the last 30 years, and they grow organic cattle, so, but as well as taking tourists. Their purpose, their first mission, or their first mission, they use words, was to go to Philippinina. Okay, there was a mission there, and at the time they had 2 missionaries and about 200 Aboriginals. There were about 5 survivors from the Tiari people, and about 250 of the Diari people. Mike, you might know those names from prospect names in South Australia. So they stayed there for a couple of days. And while they were staying there, Mr. Gregory made some side trips. This is a photograph of the mission. This is an example of a robbery that was, he wasn't there for that one, it was taken by the mission. And this is a photograph of them leaving on their departure. I'll show you this particular well. We went off to see, this is, the South Australian government put a bunch of wells on the Brisbane Road that they drilled for this cattle movement down from Queensland, and the water was about 95 degrees centigrade, and it was too hot to drink. And to cool it down, they just let it flow. And about 95% of it went to waste. So, in fact, I was in South Australia in 1982 and visited not this bore, but another bore that had been flowing for about 100 years. And it hadn't been capped at that stage, and it was just amazing. They just felt that there was no end of this flow. They just couldn't conceive that it would end. Flow rates for the engineers in the audience described as 1 million gallons per day, which equates to 24,000 barrels of water per day. So that's a huge flow. So very busy. They started back, they went back along, and then they headed towards Lake Eyre. The main purpose of this trip, one, to see Lake Eyre, but they had been advised that there was a lot of fossil bones in the creek, and that was the main purpose of their exercise. So Jack left that to his students, and he went off to Lake Eyre because it was there. And that's a photograph of him coming back from Lake Eyre. Now, let's outline these lakes here. Let me switch those off for a second. They're not nice and white. That when you look, if you're looking for Lake Eyre on that map, it's quite difficult, and the boundary is but there's a lot of dirt on. It's not all salt. There's a lot of just sediment on there as well. This is their march up through the dunes. I tried to map this as well as I could. Presumably they went between the dunes. And it wasn't a very pleasant environment. But I also wanted to show you again, the man was quite eloquent when he wrote. All of the books that he's written are very easy to read. He used to write his articles for the general public to read. He was a very popular character. He was franchised about 5 or 6 newspapers, and he had a good style to him. So this is the trip, the last part of the trip, came down to Calamarina and set off along the Calamarina. Again, they were looking for fossils along this part of the trip, and he did a side trip over here to, doesn't state how far he went, it's just that it took him a couple of days to go there and back. He was looking, he heard that somebody had taken over the station here, and he was looking for fresh meat supplies, but they weren't available. So I spent this part of the trip and see if we can see some of these photographs. So one of the reasons why these water holes exist on the river, and I didn't know this, but I can't do that. The sand dunes are actually trap the water, trap the rain, and act as a kind of a soak. And where there's a low spot in the river, then the water from the sand dunes drains into the river. Whereas because he tried to find an explanation for this, for why there had been no water flowing in the river for months or years, and it hadn't rained, where was the water coming from? These fresh water holes were staying with water. So these dunes, you can see they're not pure sand, they're loamy as well. So they have barriers in them that stop the water from just going down, and they flow out to the lowest place. And how serious are these water holes? Well, they're very serious. Getting a camel's bog was a problem for them. So they left the Diamantina come Warburton at that point, headed across catch a train at Warringah. And the Niels River was the reason why they had to shift the Garn route, because it was always, you would shut the train down for weeks when it flowed. So what are the lessons learned from his trip? Okay, the flowing bores. The water source was not exhaustible, was exhaustible. You couldn't run sheep in this country because the sheep would tear the grass out by the roots. So when the rain came, it wouldn't grow back. So they could only run cattle in this country. Lesson number 2. They thought that the diprotodon had died out before Aborigines had come to Australia. At that time, they thought Aborigines had been here for about 10,000 years, and they knew that the diprotodons had died out 40,000 years ago. But later, we discovered Mungo Man, and they demonstrated that Aborigines had been in the country for 50 to 60,000 years. So they concluded from that that the Aboriginals led to the extinction of the diprotodons. The last lesson. Should you go to Lake Eyre in the middle of summer? Have the English learned? No. So this is the Barmy Army in a test match in Melbourne. So I wanted to talk about some of the other things in his life. When he went back to Glasgow, he left Australia in about 1904 or 5 and went to Glasgow to be the Professor of Geology up there. One of the tasks he was given was to go and decide, this is in 1909, where they were looking for a Jewish homeland because nobody wanted Jews at the time. And so they looked everywhere for where they might home them. And he wrote a report. This is the now the north of Libya, and had support from the Libyan government. But he described it as unsuitable. He also was what we would now call a racist, but at the time they referred to it as racialism, which was simply the belief that white people were superior to coloured people. And so he wrote a lot of books about this. And one of the criticisms of The Dead Heart of Australia, that you'll see in the book review, which is at the back there, was that he spent a lot of time in that book talking about how blacks were inferior and describing them in just very derogatory terms. But speaking as a scientist, so he just disguised it, or probably didn't recognise it himself, just disguised it as I'm a scientist talking about races. And also something else that came out of this, which I didn't know about. There was a plan in 1907 to have a Jewish homeland in the Kimberley. So, and that plan didn't die until after World War II in the state of Israel. Oh no, sorry. I think it was 43. It was during the Second World War. So But finally, I'd like to just talk about his last trip. At this stage of his life, he was 68 years old. Very good age. There it is. This is a trip of 1,250 kilometres and started off in what's the place names? But eventually it came unstuck when he was travelling down the river here. Canoes that he was in tipped over and he was never found again. So that's a pretty, to take on a mission like this at that age was pretty ambitious, and he didn't have the physical strength to complete it, but he still went. I just want to talk about some of his contemporaries. So this stamp on the left has got Edgeworth Davis, who was one of the men that went to the South Magnetic Pole with Mawson. He was invited to the opening of a Parliament in Melbourne in 1901, because we didn't have Canberra in 1901. He was a contemporary, but not an admirer of Robert Falcon Scott. Shackleton was an admirer of his, and he insisted on having students from, when he went on his journey in 1912, he took students from Gregory and Edgeworth Davis. He hobnobbed it in his Royal Society with H.G. Wells and Rudyard Kipling, and he'd also met Mr. S.A. Andre in his time. So he was, he's a forgotten person now, but at the time he was extremely well known and respected. And I just don't have the time to show you all the trips that he made, but he was a very, very ambitious man in terms of, and he used to write books. He wrote over 300 papers and 23 books. And he wrote all of these books when he was on boats, because to get around the world in those days, you had to take long boat trips, and boat trips to Australia and New Zealand for 6 weeks. These are my references. This book here, books with the stars on them, I've actually chock full of references themselves. Well, this is a published paper. Geographical, this is the one about Cyrenaica, Trove, all the old newspaper articles. You can search for any of these things when he was in Australia. All these books with the blue are available online through something called archive.org. Okay, the books are all there, and you can read them. The beauty of reading the books in digital format is that they are searchable, and all the images that you saw came out of those books today. And this other book in the middle here, which is written by Bernard Leith, who was also a professor of geology at the University of Glasgow. And that's a fantastic book, but you have to be pretty keen on your subject matter because it's about $170. So, and I was pretty keen on the subject matter. So that's the end of the talk. Happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Henk. That was a very fascinating walkthrough of the life and times of J.W. Gregory. Do we have any questions from the floor? Ralph, let's lead us off.
In your researches, Henk, did you ever come across J.P. Thompson, who is founder of this Queensland Society? Was there any connection?
I'm not aware. He was fond of writing about himself.
So was Thompson.
Probably why they never wrote about each other.
suppose there's no connection with AC Gregory, would you know?
No, again, that's a pretty common name, and it turns up that there's a Lake Gregory not very far. It was on the edge of this map actually that I showed before. That may have been your Mr. AC Gregory associated with the Royal Society here. So,
Well, because he's an Englishman, I guess Gregory, I don't think he was born in Australia, but he was based in Australia, not
Yeah.
necessarily related at all.
Do we have anything else from the floor off the back?
Did he actually find any fossil tape?
yes, they found the majority of the fossils. The question was, did they find fossils? But the majority of the fossils were actually found in the Warburton, and I don't know how many. They didn't describe that in the book, but they took them back to the University of Melbourne, and then he took half of them with him when he went to University of Glasgow. And in this reference here, by Brannigan and Lim, they said that they refound the fossils. They lost them. They refound them in 1974. So I don't know what happened to the ones in Glasgow. So there is actually a museum, like the Australian Natural Museum, I think it's called. And there's a photograph of a skeleton of a diprotodon. So hopefully they gathered enough parts between Gregory and all the other explorers to put together a skeleton.
I think they found a lot of megafauna in Lake Eyre.
Yeah.
Southeast.
Do we have anything else? Quick, just check online as well. If anyone has a quick question, please make sure you put it in the chat. That's all looking clear. Well, if there's nothing further, we might call that as an end for the evening. Thank you everyone for coming along. Thank you, Henk, for presenting once again. Always have to do the quick plug, of course, if you're not a member just yet, please do consider it. It's as little as a cup of coffee each month spread across the year. So please do think of joining up. We have a wonderful program of lectures, as well as numerous other activities and volunteering opportunities as well, with things such as our geography competition. So please do consider that, and please keep an eye on the bulletin and the website for upcoming events. We do plan to have an August lecture. However, sadly, our presenter who was listed has pulled out as of today. So we will be working frantically to get someone else confirmed in a month's time. So do watch this space. It should hopefully be very exciting. Thank you everyone online, in person. We'll see you all again very soon.
Does it stop recording?
Yep. And goodbye to everyone online.